Victoria Whitmore's fork froze halfway to her mouth. The 72-year-old widow hadn't heard laughter at her dining table in 3 years, not since the cancer took her husband and left her alone in a mansion built for joy, but now drowning in silence. The mahogany table stretched before her, 16 empty chairs surrounding one occupied seat, until tonight, when 80-year-old Kevin slipped into the chair beside hers, his dark eyes sparkling with innocent hope. Margaret Pierce's voice shattered the moment like glass. "Victoria, what is this child doing at our family table?" The sister-in-law stood in the doorway, her skeletal frame rigid with manufactured outrage, her eyes fixed on Kevin with the kind of cold calculation that turns human beings into obstacles. "Carmen, control your son immediately. He has no business dining with his betters." Kevin's small hands trembled. The napkin he'd so carefully placed on his lap suddenly felt like evidence of a crime he didn't understand. Carmen rushed from the kitchen, her face flushed with terror and shame. "Mrs. Victoria, I'm so sorry. Kevin, come here right now." But Victoria raised one hand, and the room held its breath. Her steel-gray eyes locked onto Margaret with an intensity that could freeze fire. "Carmen, stay exactly where you are." Victoria's voice carried the weight of decades building empires and crushing competitors who underestimated her. "Kevin, you are welcome at this table. In fact, I would very much enjoy your company." The shock rippled through Margaret's face like a stone hitting still water. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This wasn't the natural order she'd spent a lifetime protecting. Margaret's thin lips curled into something approximating a smile, but her eyes blazed with fury. "Victoria, have you lost your mind? What will our circle say when they discover you're dining with the help's child? A black child, no less, sitting where your husband once sat." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air like poison gas. "People will think you've gone senile." Victoria chewed her salmon slowly, watching Kevin relax by degrees. There was something about the boy's quiet dignity that reached through the ice encasing her heart. Something in the way he didn't fight back or demand space, but simply existed with gentle courage. "Margaret," Victoria said finally, her voice soft but loaded with authority, "this is my house, my table, my decision. Kevin is my guest." Margaret Pierce didn't storm out immediately. That came later after she'd made careful mental notes of every detail, every crack in Victoria's armor that prejudice had revealed. She'd been waiting for an opening like this for 3 years, ever since the will reading where she discovered her inheritance was locked behind Victoria's infuriatingly long life. Now she had her ammunition, a lonely widow making irrational decisions, letting servants forget their place, elevating a black child to family status, perfect. What Victoria didn't see in that moment was Margaret's calculating smile as she left, the smile that said checkmate before the game had truly begun. What Victoria couldn't know was that Margaret had already contacted Dr. Harrison Mitchell, a psychiatrist whose medical license was as flexible as his ethics, or that David Wellington, the family lawyer, was already drafting documents to question Victoria's mental competence. The machinery of greed had started turning, greased by prejudice and powered by a $1 million inheritance. 3 days later, Margaret returned with reinforcements. The brown leather briefcase under her arm contained weapons sharper than knives. David Wellington followed her into Victoria's living room, wearing the expression of a man who'd sold his soul and was determined to get his money's worth. "Victoria, we need to discuss your recent behavioral concerns," Margaret announced, planting herself in the velvet armchair like she owned it. Dr. Mitchell emerged from behind them, a stranger with a clipboard and the dead eyes of a man who'd stopped seeing patients as human beings long ago. "Mrs. Whitmore, based on detailed reports of your erratic behavior and inappropriate attachment to your staff, I've determined you require immediate psychiatric evaluation." His voice was clinical, detached, the tone of someone reading a grocery list. The inappropriate fraternization with employees and their families suggests declining judgment. Victoria continued her embroidery, each stitch deliberate and precise. Kevin played quietly in the corner, building towers from wooden blocks she'd given him. Carmen dusted the bookshelf, her hands shaking with barely contained rage. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. "Inappropriate fraternization," Victoria repeated, as if testing the words for poison. "Is that what we're calling basic human kindness now?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Victoria, darling, you're being manipulated. Carmen deliberately brought her son here, knowing you were vulnerable and alone. She's using that child to secure a position in this family, to work her way into your will." She turned to Carmen with theatrical disgust. "It's actually quite clever. Prey on a lonely widow's emotions. Make her think she's found family, when really she's being robbed blind." Carmen's composure shattered. "That's a vicious lie. I've worked honestly here for 2 years, never asked for anything beyond my salary." Tears of fury streaked her face, but Margaret just smiled wider. "Of course you wouldn't ask directly, that would be too obvious. But letting your son charm a mentally declining widow, that's sophisticated manipulation. Almost admirable if it weren't so despicable." Victoria set down her embroidery with deliberate care. When she stood, the room seemed to shift around her, power radiating from her small frame like heat from a furnace. "Margaret, you just accused Carmen of using her 8-year-old son as a pawn in an inheritance scheme. That's not just insulting, that's revealing." She walked slowly toward Margaret, each step measured. "It tells me exactly how your mind works, how you see the world, how you calculate human relationships." Margaret lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm protecting family interests from opportunistic outsiders. If you won't act rationally, I'll be forced to take other measures." The threat hung in the air like a blade. David Wellington shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by his shoes. Dr. Mitchell checked his watch, calculating how much longer he'd need to maintain this charade before collecting his payment. "Other measures?" Victoria repeated softly. "How exactly?" Margaret's smile turned triumphant. "There are facilities specializing in care for elderly individuals making impaired decisions due to isolation and grief. Beautiful places where you'd receive proper supervision." The implications were crystal clear. Declare Victoria incompetent, lock her away in a gilded cage, and let Margaret inherit everything while Victoria rotted in forced confinement. Victoria looked at Kevin, still playing innocently, unaware his presence had triggered a war for millions of dollars and one woman's freedom. She looked at Carmen, trembling with righteous anger, but powerless against people with lawyers and money. She looked at Margaret, practically salivating at the thought of victory. And Victoria smiled. It was the coldest smile Margaret had ever seen, and for the first time in her entitled life, she felt genuine fear. "I see," Victoria said quietly. "Then I suppose we should discuss evidence." She walked to her desk and picked up a tablet, her movements unhurried and precise. "Dr. Mitchell, would you mind repeating your diagnosis loudly for everyone to hear?" The psychiatrist straightened, emboldened by Margaret's presence. "I said you require immediate psychiatric hospitalization due to impaired judgment and undue influence from your staff. Victoria tapped the tablet screen. Dr. Mitchell's own voice filled the room, crystal clear and utterly damning. For $45,000 cash, I'd be willing to diagnose almost anything. Early senility, undue influence. Whatever you need, documented. The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Mitchell's face drained of all color. Margaret's mouth opened and closed soundlessly like a fish drowning in air. Interesting recording, isn't it? Victoria continued, her voice now carrying the edge of a woman who'd crushed corporate rivals and hostile takeover attempts for 3 decades. Jonathan Myers is extraordinarily efficient. He managed to record your entire conversation at that discreet office in the business district, the one where you discussed paying a doctor to falsify mental health records. She turned to Margaret with mock sympathy. Did you really think I survived 40 years in real estate without learning to document everything? Margaret tried to recover, her voice shrill with desperation. Those recordings are illegal. Unauthorized surveillance isn't admissible. Victoria laughed, genuinely amused. Margaret, you're talking to someone who fought zoning boards and corrupt city officials for decades. Jonathan was posing as a patient in the adjacent waiting room. Dr. Mitchell was speaking so loudly about his criminal services that half the floor probably heard no expectation of privacy, completely legal. She tapped the screen again. This time, Margaret's voice echoed through the room. If we get her admitted for 72-hour psychiatric observation, we can contest all her recent decisions, especially any will changes favoring unsuitable people. The black housekeeper and her kid have to go, Carmen gasped. Finally, understanding the full scope of the conspiracy against her employer and her son, David Wellington took a step backward, mentally calculating his escape route. Victoria, I can explain. Margaret came to me saying, you were genuinely ill. I was trying to help. Victoria turned to him with the expression of someone discovering something rotten. David, would you like me to play the recording where you discuss forging medical documents? Or perhaps the one where you research how to have someone declared legally incompetent based on fabricated evidence? Margaret exploded, realizing her allies were abandoning ship. You're bluffing. There's no way you could have recorded private conversations without us knowing. Victoria walked to the side table and opened a thick folder, scattering documents across the sofa like accusations made manifest. Bank statements showing your gambling debts, $200,000 lost in Atlantic City over 3 years. Correspondence with real estate agents secretly trying to sell your house. Emails to David discussing strategies to have me institutionalized. She held up a photograph, the image sharp and clear. Margaret handing an envelope to Dr. Mitchell in a casino parking lot at 2 a.m. Jonathan is remarkably talented with a telephoto lens. And here's my personal favorite. Victoria produced another document, Dr. Mitchell's medical license suspension history. Did you know he's lost his license in 2 other states for falsifying psychiatric reports? Ohio and Nevada? The internet is amazing for background checks. Dr. Mitchell tried to edge toward the door, but Victoria blocked his path with surprising speed for a 72-year-old woman. Oh, doctor, don't leave yet. I'm sure the state medical board will be fascinated by your innovative practice model, especially when they learn about the other 12 cases Jonathan uncovered where you provided fraudulent diagnoses for cash. The doctor's face went from white to green. How did you know about those? Thorough research and excellent investigators, Victoria said simply. When someone threatens my freedom and tries to weaponize my grief, I don't get angry. I get comprehensive. She turned back to Margaret, who now looked like she'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. You made one critical miscalculation, Margaret. You assumed loneliness meant weakness. You thought grief had made me vulnerable. You believed I'd forgotten how to fight. Margaret collapsed into a chair, her carefully constructed plan disintegrating around her like wet paper. You can't do this. I'm family. Robert would want me to protect you. Victoria's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Robert despised you, Margaret. He told me countless times you only appeared when you needed money. In fact, he left me a letter. She walked to the wall safe and extracted a sealed envelope, written 3 months before he died, describing exactly this scenario and authorizing me to completely disinherit anyone who tried to exploit me. The sound of sirens approaching made everyone freeze. Margaret's eyes went wide with panic. "What did you do?" Victoria checked her watch with casual precision. "When Jonathan discovered your financial crimes, we thought it prudent to contact the IRS about some fascinating discrepancies in your tax returns. Also, the FBI regarding conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Also, the state bar about David's ethics violations. I believe they're all arriving simultaneously." David Wellington found his voice barely a whisper. "Victoria, please, we can make a deal." Victoria shook her head slowly. "David, you conspired to have me forcibly institutionalized using a bribed doctor and fabricated evidence. The only deal you'll be making is with the prosecutor about how many years you'll serve." Dr. Mitchell made one final desperate attempt to reach the door. But Carmen stepped into his path, her fear transformed into fury. Dr. Carmen said, her voice shaking but determined, "You were willing to destroy a woman's life and separate a child from the only stable home he's ever known, all for money. You're not leaving until the police take you, as if choreographed." 3 patrol cars pulled up outside, followed by 2 unmarked federal vehicles. Through the window, Victoria watched officers approaching the mansion. Margaret looked up at Victoria with something approaching genuine confusion. How did you do all this?" Victoria sat down gracefully, folding her hands in her lap, like she was serving tea instead of executing revenge. "Margaret, I spent 40 years building a real estate empire in a male-dominated industry. I survived hostile takeovers, corrupt politicians trying to steal my land, and competitors who thought a woman couldn't possibly understand finance." She leaned forward, her voice soft but merciless. "You made the amateur's mistake. You showed your cards too early. You let your prejudice blind you. You looked at Kevin and saw a weapon to use against me instead of what he actually is. A child who showed me more genuine affection in 3 dinners than you displayed in 20 years of marriage to my husband." Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. When the police entered, they found an elegant elderly woman calmly explaining a conspiracy while serving juice to a child. Margaret Pierce was handcuffed while still trying to argue about family traditions and the proper social order. Dr. Mitchell was led away, protesting his innocence despite the recordings. David Wellington went quietly, already calculating which colleague might represent him. Victoria watched them go with neither satisfaction nor regret, just the quiet certainty of justice correctly applied. 2 years later, the Whitmore mansion had been reborn. What was once a mausoleum of silence now echoed with life. Kevin, now 10 years old, sat at the dining table doing homework while explaining his science project to Victoria, who listened with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. Carmen had been promoted to estate manager with a salary that made her cry when Victoria first proposed it. The dining room table that once seated one now regularly hosted 8 or 9. Jonathan Myers came for Sunday dinners, bringing his grandchildren. Patricia Coleman, the attorney who'd helped orchestrate Margaret's downfall, stopped by weekly to discuss the educational foundation Victoria had established. Kevin's teachers visited to marvel at his mathematical genius. Nurtured by Victoria's constant encouragement and expensive tutoring, Margaret Pierce was serving 3 years in federal prison for elder abuse, conspiracy, and fraud. Her mansion had been sold to pay restitution. Her social circle had evaporated the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. Dr. Mitchell lost his medical license permanently and faced additional charges. In 2 other states, David Wellington was disbarred and working as a paralegal, his career destroyed by his own greed. Aunt Victoria, Kevin said during Sunday dinner, surrounded by the makeshift family they'd created, my math teacher says I might qualify for the state science competition. She wants to meet you to discuss my project. Victoria's smile could have lit the entire mansion. Of course, sweetheart. I wouldn't miss it for anything. She watched him return to his homework. This brilliant child who'd sat timidly at her table 2 years ago and changed everything. Carmen stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Victoria with Kevin. The transformation still amazed her. Not just the financial security, though that was life-changing. It was the sense of belonging, of being valued, not despite who they were, but because of it. Victoria had fought for them when the world told her to cast them aside. That kind of loyalty was priceless. Jonathan Myers arrived with the quarterly foundation report. 140 scholarships approved this year for underprivileged children. Your husband would be proud, Victoria. She looked around the table at her chosen family. This collection of people who'd proven that love transcends blood and prejudice destroys only those who harbor it. Robert would be proud of this, she corrected, gesturing to the full table. A house that's finally a home. The lesson was written in every laugh, every shared meal, every scholarship granted. Margaret had gambled everything on prejudice and lost not just money but her freedom and dignity. She'd looked at an 8-year-old black child and seen only a threat to her inheritance, never seeing the actual treasure Victoria had found. Family, real family, isn't determined by genetics or skin color. It's built through loyalty, sacrifice, and the courage to love openly. True power isn't in money or social position. It's in the courage to reject prejudice when everyone expects you to embrace it. Victoria could have protected her inheritance by casting Kevin and Carmen aside. Instead, she risked everything to defend them and discovered that real family is worth more than any inheritance. Margaret died bitter and alone in prison 2 years into her sentence. Victoria lived surrounded by love until 93, with Kevin and his own children by her side until the very end.